that. So I thought I'd bring it up and that it's an idea and it's minimal cost to us, but it could be put together and, you know, something.
In your opinion, I think I probably know the answer to this, but just to verify, is Art attending the Kalamazoo Trade Show once a year, twice a year?
Twice a year. Twice
forward.
Sometime last spring when we were last winter when Doug did his other stuff for us on meat packing and things like that, we talked about possibly doing something on icing operations. We plugged it into this month. Doug agreed that he could do it, and so this month we're going to talk about icing operations and in the 50s or icing and the whole process. So with that, Doug's been with us before. He does a great job presenting, and he's a good friend, and we'll look forward to another interesting presentation today. So we'll turn it over to Doug to share his screen, and we'll be off on our way.
Okay,
in Iowa, Doug.
Thank you. I want to make sure everybody's got their cake and their powdered sugar and their cream, because we're going to talk about icing cake. Is that correct? Share screen. Let's see what I can do here.
Yep. That's about as long as I can make it. Just full disclosure, Doug is recording his presentation. So that's what the prompting you were hearing was about.
There, can you see that?
Yeah, I support bikinis.
All right. Well, what you're seeing there is the end of a fruit packing crate. They often use graphics to grab the attention of buyers as well as sellers. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the crates that went into refrigerator cars and how they were kept at proper temperatures during shipping. So as Rich said, I am Doug Harding. I know he gave some fancy title, but I ignored what he said, and I'm going to do what I want to do. Feel free to ask questions.
Good job, Doug.
Yeah. So let's start with the ice. This is a shot of them harvesting ice on Donner Lake at Boca, California, about 1915. As you can see, there's a whole slew of guys out there on the ice. They're cutting out chunks and taking them over, and then you can see a string of cars in the background. Here's a closer example. This is in New Hampshire in 36, and a lot of physical labor in cutting ice off of frozen lakes and ponds. And here you can see they're sliding the chunks of ice up into a truck for delivery to a ice house. Here's another shot. This is not sure, well, it's Harold Times at Elevator. I don't know where that's at, but you can see the fellow with his pick here pushing the blocks of ice up into bobsleds drawn by horses. So later they got into more mechanical means of cutting ice using a large power saw. So, and then, the operations were, they didn't really need refrigerator cars in the middle of winter. They just used standard box cars, load the ice up in the box cars, take them where they were to be loaded into the ice houses. So this is somewhere out west on the Union Pacific, and you can see they got more of a mechanized system of getting the ice out of the water and up into the waiting box cars. Here's a shot. This is New Boston, Illinois. This is on CB&Q, right on the Mississippi River. And they're cutting ice on the river and working it up into the waiting box cars. Here's another shot pulling ice out of the river in New Boston right up directly into the ice house. And typically ice would be packed in sawdust once it was in the ice house. And here's gives you an idea of what was required. The ice would be stacked up in layers, and they had to have a means at the ice house to get access to the different layers. So they had quite an array of ramps and decks here, and then there'd be appropriate doors at each level to shove the ice in. So here is more of a mechanized, this is on the Great Northern up in Minnesota. Again, and here they've got refrigerator cars. They're filling with blocks of ice. This is we got a Milwaukee car similar that you can see they're sliding ice down along the ramp here. This fellow's grabbing it with a hook, getting ready to pull it into the box car and stack it up. So this is at harvesting at Worthington, Minnesota in 1896. So this has been going on for a long time. And in case you think this stopped, when I lived in southeast Iowa and in the heart of Amish country, we had a fellow there who was still harvesting ice, an Amish fellow harvesting ice off the local ponds for the Amish ice houses, so that because they didn't have electricity, they didn't have modern refrigeration, they still depended upon ice. So this process still goes on in some parts of our country. So here we are loading box cars or refrigerator cars with big blocks of ice. This looks like mechanical ice that's been produced in an ice plant. They typically were 300-pound blocks. So you can see this fellow is fairly well developed for moving ice all day long. And some of the icing tools that they used, of course, a shovel. This is a fork that was used for chopping these blocks of ice into smaller blocks. And then the pick was called the picaroon. So this is Clear Lake, Iowa, the ice house there. You can see the elaborate ramp going up into getting the ice in place. Here's the remains of an ice house from 1972. There, I can't remember now who's got the kit out that looks very similar to this. You can see the multiple doors for the different levels of packing ice in there and the ventilation, but this would be a double-walled, walls might be insulated with something like sawdust, and it was very typical. Here you can see a couple fellows sitting up on that ramp, and the ladders required for them. And here is an ice house that was in Dubuque, Iowa, on the Mississippi River again, about 1940. You can see the elaborate mechanisms they had for getting ice as they started building up the layers of ice in the ice house. These ice houses would keep the ice in solid, if it was packed full, packed with sawdust, there would still be ice there in the end of July and August. It might be a little wet, might be a little bit smaller, but there were still large chunks of ice in these ice houses through the end of the summer. So, mechanical ice. Here's the interior of a mechanical ice production facility. You can see the large motor there in the background. And these are all, you can see the hinges here. These are all cans. And these cans are sitting down into an ammonia chilled slurry of water. And you can see here he's using a hoist to lift up one of the cans that they would fill these cans with water, set them down in that chilled slurry. They would form ice in a matter of hours, a 300-pound block of ice. And so this was a year-round 24-hour operation. So now let's go. Why do we need ice? Well, if you want to keep your beer cold, you had to have ice, right? So here's a boxcar loaded with barrels of some sort of liquor in LA. But you can see the loading process. A lot of fruit, produce, and meat, of course, was shipped in refrigerator cars, and they had to be kept at certain temperatures. I'm going to go through a series of photos here. We got a wagon loaded with boxes of celery. So here's more celery being loaded. Here we are loading celery again. These are avocados, oranges, and notice how the boxes are stacked on end so that you're not crushing the oranges as the crates have been nailed shut. And there are gaps between them, and then you'll see that on top they can only load so much. Here we are loading baskets of cucumbers, bags of potatoes. Here we're unloading a bunch of produce up on the Canadian National. Here we got bananas getting loaded. This is in Louisiana, probably New Orleans, with the IC there. They had their own special banana cars. Here we are loading apples. Peaches in Washington State. Grapes in California. Again, loading grapes in California. There we are loading potatoes in baskets up in Minnesota. More tater loading. These may be green beans shaped on the type of basket that they're, you can see how the baskets are stacked. First the layer and then upside down, and then they were laid on top. So here we are unloading a PFE car in Las Vegas. This is in San Francisco, unloading boxes of fruit. Another shot in San Francisco. You can see just, and that looks like that probably is oranges there again. You can see the labels on the end of the box. I don't see a bikini label, but you know, they were around. So here we are packing, loading tomatoes. This is in Florida on the SAL. Here's an example of lettuce being loaded and then top icing. And the fellow's got the scoop. Notice he's got a chute coming down along the conveyor, bringing the boxes of lettuce in, but he's got a chute that's dumping crushed or chipped ice on the floor of the car, and he in turn is using a scoop to shovel it up on top of these boxes. Notice the space between the boxes, and notice that there's slats or little strips of wood between each layer box to keep everything stabilized, and even if necessary to run a quick tack or nail in there to keep things from moving or shifting. Then he's also got his portable desk operation here to keep track of how many boxes have been loaded, how much ice was used, and that type of stuff. So here's another example of top ice. Just big chunks of ice have been tossed up here. These have been melted a little bit. I mentioned those are 300-pound blocks they started with. Typically, they were chopped into quarters, so you would have a 75-pound block of ice, and then that might be chopped down into smaller chunks, depending on what the shipper ordered for their cooling needs, and that was dependent upon where the load was destined and what the temperatures might be during the journey that load was traveling. And so all the railroads and the shippers had weather people across the country telling them how hot it might be going across the Mojave Desert or going through Wyoming or wherever those cars would be going. Let's see. Keep moving forward here. Loading spinach. Notice the big piles of ice. There's the chunks of ice, and then they've been getting crushed down so they can top ice the spinach. Green leafy vegetables, citrus, those type of items were easily top ice would be used. If the water from the melting ice would damage the product, they did not top ice it. Meat in particular, you had no top icing with meat. So this is in Louisiana again. These are loading strawberries. Notice we got the express reefers lined up. The first crop of strawberries were always a high commodity to gain a great price at the Eastern market, so they were shipped out as fast as they could be. Notice over here we got bags of salt so that they could get a little bit colder temperature by salting the ice down. So here's another shot of them, and you can see the local farmers, they're using whatever they had for vehicles, the runabout, the small pickups or whatever, to bring in their loads of strawberries to be loaded up on these express reefers. So yeah, we got something else being loaded here, more vegetables. Yes, this is in Florida, 1928. Canned goods. Refrigerator cars were not always used for fresh fruit and produce. They were also used for canned goods, particularly in the winter months, to keep them from freezing. So you wouldn't need ice at this time, but you still would use the insulation qualities of the car. Don't hesitate to stop me and shout if you have a question or want to comment. I'm trying not to rush, but I also have another Zoom at 10 o'clock that I'm going to have to at least pay attention to. So I got a second computer off to the side for that one. So here we are, express refrigerator. These are Wells Fargo express cars being loaded down in Texas. And here we are. This is a re-icing station at a Wells Fargo freezer, as they called it at a Texas station. You can see the chunks of ice. And again, here's a Wells Fargo express car being loaded with halibut. So, anything that needed refrigeration of any sort or cooling would be a prime commodity. Notice also how the refrigerator cars their floor is higher up because you had first insulation under there, then sometimes you had pellets of some sort for air movement, and so the ramps are higher than what the docks are. This would be a dock set up for boxcars, and they had to do an incline ramp up into the refrigerator car. So here's a diagram showing if you were using in ventilation service, that is, you had the vents open so air could flow through down through the ice bunkers on the ends of the cars. And you can see the arrows showing the airflow coming in as the car is moving in this direction, and the air is going out the other vent. You can see where there was a cavity underneath the crates for air to flow underneath the car or underneath the load. And then where the door was in the center, they often did not fill the car up 100%. They had some sort of a bracing in here to keep the boxes from moving, but allow air, and also on top. If this was a leafy load that might require top ice, but this is a ventilation service. But that gives you an idea of how loads were put into the cars. So here is a shot of an ice bunker. And notice that this shelf here, you had what they called a full ice or a half ice. I can't think of the exact term, but again, depending on the ice needs, there was no need to fill this bunker completely with ice if it was moderate temperatures. And so they would say half stage, and they would pull these shelves up, and you would just put ice on the top half of this bunker and would rest on that shelf. Then as it melted, it would drip on down and go out the drains. So most meat reefers had a contained tank where the ice melt did not get into the car whatsoever, nor did it drain out, because with meat reefers you use a lot more salt, and railroads did not like all that salt water on their infrastructure. So there was contained, you had to plug in the drain, and you had to drain those tanks out at appropriate locations. Let's see, ice. Look at that. We got a truck delivering ice to a car. Ice delivery happened all kinds of ways. This is the more physically demanding way of using ice. You got a pair of tongs, a plank, and a rope, and a couple guys. Of course, there's always that guy in the tie who's just standing there watching. Some of you probably can relate to that. Others can cuss at that. That's your choice. So moving on. Then we start getting into more mechanical means of getting the ice up to the top of the car. Particularly, this is a Worthington Ice Company, and they've got a scissors hoist here, lifting up the bed would have blocks of ice on, and there you see the fellow with his ice tools. So he's icing a particular car there. It looks like a Rock Island car leased to the Rock Island. So, and that is, yeah, that's the truck is a 1924 vehicle, and this photo is from the 40s. So here we go. This is a poor photo of a GM&O car, but you can see it basically looks like a dump truck that's got a conveyor attached to it for moving the ice up top so they can put it into the bunkers. This is a shot taken in Mason City, Iowa in 1962 by Soft Morty. Notice that, again, we got a lift truck here, but this car is parked underneath the wires of the Mason City and Clear Lake, the trolley in Mason City. So this fellow wants to be real careful as he's moving around with those metal tipped ice tools, because he's right underneath a hot wire. But he's icing up a Northwestern refrigerator car there. And this is a model that was built by Dick Williams based upon that particular photo. Yeah, he saw it at a clinic I did years ago and went home and built the model. So you too can do this on your layout. So let's look at some other, here's an elevator of sort. You guys see the guy with the tongs pulling the ice block over to the elevator. It gets lifted up, and then we get a ramp that they're sliding it over to the bunker, and they'll chop it up into the sizes as specified by the shipper. Here's another similar operation with hydraulic lift. Their Mack truck and a string of other trucks there, all with the scissors lift, a whole string of refrigerator cars. This is in the IC Markham yard. This is on the Canadian National. They're using a forklift to lift up a box containing ice so that they can ice a car in a yard. This is inside in Chicago. They're using a portable elevator and their dock trucks to move blocks of ice. And here's another shot of them getting ready to put another block of ice onto that elevator and lifting it up. So here is this is in Duluth at the team track. Again, having nice refrigerator car. And so you notice they've got a little crane up here to assist in moving those 300-pound blocks of ice. Here's a more elaborate mechanical system. This is in the Chicago area. You can see they've got an elevator with a curved chute going right to the car, and you get the blocks of ice being, oh, this is from Solar Therm. And there's another shot showing the blocks of ice going up. These are smaller blocks than what's, oh, let me go back. Notice how these blocks of ice are almost as tall as the fellow in the truck. And so he's obviously chopping them up into smaller blocks so that they can go up to the conveyor and be shoved over. And then there's the guy with the Biden breaking it up into smaller chunks. So here is this is a link belt ice slinger, re-icing hampers of peas at Denver. And you can see they've got a truck with blocks of ice. They've got a motor mounted on this truck with that's chopping it up into basically just chipping in small chips with a blower. And this fellow here is holding a hose, and he is top icing, literally blowing snow in top of these baskets of peas on this PFE reefer. And Link Belt, you may be familiar, has been a manufacturer for product moving items for a long time. So here's another example of them creating essentially snow or chipped ice, dropping blocks of ice into this hopper, which are broken up, similar to the guy who comes in and chops up all the tree limbs when you take down a tree in your yard. Similar matter, and they got a blower blowing the ice into the car and just filling it, packing it full. So here's another shot of that same operation. And you can see they're wanting to keep that product cold. Here we got a fellow up on top. He's top icing lettuce. You can see it's got a flexible spout blowing in that chipped ice. And here we are icing cauliflower in California in 1942. Notice this guy looks like he's getting ready to go out fishing cod up in the North Atlantic. He's got his fisherman's hat on, and he's got his fisherman's jacket, trying to keep from getting too wet from all the ice. Here's an ice dock, or ice deck as they sometimes are called. This is in Marion, Ohio. What I want to point out here, this is a double deck dock. You would have the lower level would be at the top of the cars. It was typical for produce, where your produce reefers often would get the large chunks of ice, but the upper deck was used for moving these carts, which would be filled with the crushed ice, which was preferred for meat shipments. And I believe at the end here we have we're icing a meat reefer down here at the end, and so the meat shipper preferred the chipped or chunked ice, nothing bigger than a fist, that they would sprinkle salt in with. The smaller the chunks of ice, the more surface for the salt to interact and get cooler temperatures. So here's another shot of that same dock. Here you can see we got a Wilson meat reefer, but this guy is chopping up ice. So we have all kinds of things happening at these ice docks. Notice that this leg here looks like a box built onto the edge of it. At the bottom of the box, there's an opening, and this would be the salt storage. And this fellow may have a scoop shovel where he can reach in and get a scoop of salt out of the bottom of that box to sprinkle on the ice as it's being chopped and put into the ice bunker. So let's look at the operations of an ice dock. Here we got, notice the chain. This ice would be coming out of the ice storage area. There would be a chain with hooks on it. A block of ice would be grabbed by a hook and moved down the line. When these guys were ready for another block of ice, he would hook it, pull it over, slide it over to this fellow who's got the bident, and he would then begin chopping it up into the required sizes. And here you can see that operation taking place. These are all, this is serious photos taken by Jack Delano, available at the Library of Congress. Here we are using that bident to chop up that block of ice that's been slid over to him. Smaller and smaller pieces. And of course, the broom necessary for sweeping off the running board here so he wouldn't slip. So. This is another shot. This is on the Santa Fe, or no, Southern Pacific in 1952. Again, you've got fellows put his bident right into the chunk of ice. This guy is used a picaroon to slide over the chunk. Notice he's keeping as far away from that bident as he can. So pre-cooling. A lot of times the cars would be cooled prior to getting loaded. And so that's what you've got going on here. We got a truck with a separate motor. You could a hopper here for receiving ice, a big blower with a large hose that would essentially fill the car door, and they would pre-cool the interior of the car. This was not all. Sometimes produce would be loaded right from the field warm. Other times they'd cool the car first. With meat, you certainly wanted to cool the car first, and that was usually done in place. Here is another Santa Fe shot by Delano. These are big tubes, pre-cooling tube pipes, and they would be placed over the ice bunkers, and cold air would be blown in there to pre-cool the car before they loaded it with ice. That way your ice lasted longer. With meat reefers, if they had a contained brine tank, they would run a chilled slurry through the tanks with an apparatus of hoses, and then they would fill the bunkers with ice as they were loading the meat at some meat plants. And here you can see all the overhead pre-cooling pipes hanging right next to the blocks of ice on the chain. As you know, once they pulled the pipe up, then they would start filling that bunker with ice. So as you can see here. Here's a nice color shot of a PFE icing operation, a bident ready to go. This is down on the Seaboard Airline, probably in Florida. Fellows working out in the sun. Notice all the burlap bags of salt back there. So here's a really nice shot. This is in Decatur, Illinois. A fellow working a double deck dock, so you know they handled meat reefers as well as produce reefers. This has got one of those bone ventilator covers, so this would be a Santa Fe reefer. They were the only ones I'm aware of that used this type of ventilator cover for a while. Notice he's got the slatted, wasn't always a solid board here. It's got hooks that hooks onto an angle iron here. Here you can see that salt box against the leg of the upper deck, and you can see the salt there. You can see a scoop shovel there for getting the salt. So here we are in Arizona icing. This is Needles, California, an ice dock. They hired a lot of college kids in the summertime, particularly the football players, because this was a good way to get them beefed up for the fall season by moving these chunks of ice around. So his Proviso yard in Chicago Northwestern in Chicago, their ice house, we've got 2 strings of reefers. You notice they're running a ramp across to the second string while they're icing there, and somebody's dumped over the cart with the bags of salt. So some interesting displays there if you want to build a model of an ice dock. This is a Fruit Growers Express somewhere down south. This is an early Fruit Growers image, and notice this fellow's these hatches would have insulation plugs. Sometimes they were fastened to the hatch, sometimes they were loose, and he's carrying one in his hand that he's just pulled out so that they can fill the bunker. And then once the bunker's filled, they'll put that insulation plug back in place and then close the hatch cover. So another shot here, you can see some of those insulation plugs laying loose as they're filling the bunkers with ice. Just another shot of the conveyor with the chain conveyor with the blocks that would move the ice along to where it was needed. This is an interesting operation. This is in Monroe, Washington. This is the Fry Lettuce Farm. They had their own icing operation. They were that large as far as a grower. And you can see they got a whole string of Fruit Grower Express as they're growing lettuce up in central Washington. Here's another shot of their operation. This is a Wenatchee, Washington, Great Northern. Wenatchee was known for the apples that they raised. And so again, we get the ice going out. Here's a PFE hatch open for ventilation. And you can see the those of you who have built the refrigerator car models, the little pieces that hold the hatch open, those are vital. You got to put those on your models, right? So here's a fellow, he's using his hook to open the hatch up. Here we go, here we're on an express reefer and they're icing. This is Hammond, Illinois. This fellow's moving a block of ice from one car to the other. The blocks are big enough that they would slide over across that gap. He just hopes he doesn't fall in with the slippery ice. This is an icing platform in Iowa somewhere. You'll notice again the bags of salt on the one side and the empty burlap bags on the other side. So, and here is how, you know, this guy has got a mechanism here for directing the ice right where he wants it. So, and he can slide that along. And here's a mechanized way of moving blocks of ice coming up from below. There we go. They're anticipating a train coming in. They want to ice it as quickly as possible, so they're stockpiling blocks of ice on the deck. And then you can also see the chute from the overhead if that's necessary. So just more operations. This is Chicago in 43. There's the needles again. More icing, reefer, PFE reefers. Here is a good example. These are, you can see where this platform is hinged, held in place with chains. Here it's folded up where it's not needed and folded down so you can get the access to two cars, the 2 car ends and the ice hatches. So there's a color photo. Here we are chopping ice. More chopping ice, chopping ice. A lot of physical work went into this process. Here we are adding salt. A fellow got a bucket and he's sprinkling salt in there, and then the fellow standing next to him with his clipboard, and he's taking notes of how much salt is being added, because again, the shipper would specify how many pounds of salt versus how many pounds of ice. It might be 2 buckets full of salt. It might be 2 scoops. It might be, 10 pounds of ice or whatever, or salt, excuse me. So, here's a shot. Here's this fellow. He's chalking on the hatch cover how much ice is going to be needed. He's looking at these, open these up. He sees how much ice is in there. And so he's chalking on here. So when the guys are moving the ice over, know exactly how many chunks or pounds or whatever to put in it. And see, he's got a clipboard there so he can note, this is car number. We put so many pounds of ice in, because that would be charged to the shipper. Here we are icing a reefer in Chicago. Notice they've got some sort of a bucket or almost a wheelbarrow type apparatus that they're got chunked ice. So let's look at that type of operation. This is Indiana Harbor Belt in the Chicago area. Notice the upper deck has got all these carts on here. These are ice carts for moving that chipped or chunked ice. Here's a good shot of one being used. They had a hinged end. You could tip up the cart and the ice would slide out into the bunker. So this ice would be already loaded, and you can see they're covered with tarps. So when they had a reefer train coming in, they would have carts all lined up ready to go. Here's another shot. This you can see is the crushed ice. This is in Lincoln, Nebraska in 48. Very possibly a meat reefer being loaded with ice. And he's got a chute there where he is guiding the ice into the bunker. So now we got, here's the salt cart. We got the ice cart here covered with tarp. Here's the salt cart and the guy with a scoop shovel, and he's just put probably a scoop of salt down in there as they're getting ready to add more ice. So again, this is Chicago, and see how these carts are. There is a company that makes laser cut models of these ice carts. Can't think of who it is. He does boats and other things, but he's got really nice models of these little ice carts should you want to put one on your layout. We also use chutes. Here's an operation. This is at Point St. Charles up on the Canadian National. But and here's another example where we're on the upper deck, the ice cart filled with the crushed ice and the chute going down to the Pacific by a very particular bunker. This is again the Indiana Harbor Belt. Shows you clearly how the chute is aimed for the bunker, and you can also see the box here built for the salt. There's the chutes up and out of the way. This is a nice shot taken at night. This is in Waterloo, Iowa. The detail is very good in this photo, showing the ice, crushed ice going in, and then that salt box, the construction of against the leg of the deck. So, and of course, you always got the supervisor there, making sure. And they're icing an armor reefer. So that was a meat.
Having a cigarette.
Got his hands out of the way.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yes, they clean that way.
So, now this is an interesting shot. This is inside an Oscar Mayer facility, and notice that as they're loading the refrigerator cars, that they've got overhead rail system with buckets, and these buckets would contain the crushed ice. So they're icing these reefers as they're being loaded. This was a faster process. They would pre-cool the reefer somewhere else. As I mentioned, that chilled slurry with out of the ammonia ice plants, and then they would ice in place with the typical overhead system like this. And if you study meatpacking plants, you often see some sort of wood or steel grid over the top of the tracks with rails where they could move these buckets of ice out and dump them as the cars are being loaded. So, of course, not always was it ice that went into the refrigerator cars. Sometimes in the winter months, they had to put in heaters. These are some heaters sitting on the ice dock ready to be loaded. Here's a fellow getting ready to either drop it down in or pull it back out. Here's an example drawing of how the heater would be secured in that ice bunker with a couple of chains to hold it in place. And then here's a diagram of a slightly different type of heater that had the handle was connected to this folding arm apparatus that would lock it in place by dropping the handle. And then when you pulled up on the handle, it would pull up the center of the mechanism and allow you to pull that heater back out. Typically, these were heated with charcoal, similar to what we would grill steaks with, or some of them would be kerosene. The kerosene heaters were designed a little differently. The biggest problem with the heaters was that these, carbon dioxide. And so this was always done with a two-man crew if someone had to go down inside the bunker. In case he got overcome, he had another man outside who could pull him out quickly. So that was one of the dangers of dealing with heaters. Here's a fellow, he's using his hook to drop the heater down in there or pull it out. So he's not going down in there. He figured out a way to do it. And here they've got an overhead chain bringing the heaters out. This is load them on a cart, station them down along the dock space so that they were ready to go. They probably already had charcoal lit and were ready to drop in place as the string of cars came in to be loaded. The other thing with refrigerator cars, you had to service them. This is a PFE servicing platform in Roseville, California in '62. Notice the broom, the cart with supplies, the chunks of ice, and here they are probably working on a drain. Here you can see water coming out of this drain as they're draining out the ice bunker in this car. And this one those guys are gathered there probably because they had a frozen pipe. Here's a pipe plugged with ice in 1954. And this was common, particularly with the salt. As it got down here and stopped, they would freeze up again because of the cold temperature from the salt and plug these drains up. And so then the car knockers had to come along and open them up. So this is an interesting operation. This is Portillo, California. We got a string of cars here with their hatches open, but notice up along the ice dock, we got a higher level track with cars loaded with ice. And this was their ice supplies. They didn't have an ice house. They just had a couple cars with ice. And what's interesting, I have another photo of the same scene with the notation that they put 3 tons of ice in each car. That would be equivalent to 20 300-pound blocks. 20 blocks per car. You got 4 bunkers. So you were putting 5 of those blocks in each of these bunkers. And they said they had a record time of filling 25 cars in. I couldn't quite make out because the photo was damaged right where it had the minutes noted, but it looked like a 5. I've heard of ice docks that would be icing up to 50 cars in roughly half an hour to 45 minutes. A typical train of reefers would be re-iced once a day, once every 24 hours, and they typically plan 45 minutes to an hour to stop on an ice dock to have the cars re-iced. Depending on the length of the dock, or they might have to move the train 2 or 3 times. The dock was usually long enough to accommodate a certain number of cars. So these guys, if they were putting 5 of those big blocks of ice in each of these bunkers, and you can see they got multiple teams at each car, they were moving pretty good and doing a lot of heavy work in a very short period of time. So here we are unloading some cars somewhere. So let's look at some of the ice houses and things. This is Juanita, Pennsylvania, their icing station. You can see the ice dock there and the chutes. Here's another shot of that operation in Pennsylvania. An early armor car there. Here we are chopping. This is in Roseville, California. Nice shot of Roseville showing the guys up there working on a steel reefer. Stage icing, it says, convertible ice bunks, air circulation fans. You see the fan down here. This was common for produce reefers. Meat reefers did not have fans because the air would dry the meat out too much. So there were no fans on meat reefers. Here we are, Laramie, Wyoming. This is a shot of Pocatello, Idaho. The ice dock, you can see these are long buildings. This is in Pasco, Washington on the MP. This is Huntington, Pennsylvania on the Pennsy. This is California again in the 20s. Then you had the ice companies that made the ice. Puritan Ice was one company. This was a new facility built in Santa Barbara. We got a couple of photos. You can see the ice delivery trucks. This one even's got a trailer on it. But here's their brand new ice dock, all set up and ready to go. And they even had a party there with a bunch of dignitaries in suits and hats. But you can see, one, we got overhead communication lines. We've got, it looks like overhead cranes for helping move the blocks of ice. And you got some poor worker out here in his work clothes demonstrating how they moved the ice over and loaded these cars with all these guys standing around watching. And this poor guy in his white overalls is just going, oh yeah, just what I needed my first day at work was a bunch of people watching. So here we are, re-icing station in Norfolk, Virginia, 1916. This one's a seaboard down in Florida. Another shot at, this is Jacksonville, Florida. This is Baldwin, Florida. These ice docks were everywhere. This is the Santa Fe Bakersfield. So, and their ice dock. A bunch of photos here. There we got a fellow. This is called barring the ice. What he's doing, he's poking his pole down in there to push ice down into all the voids. They want to get as much ice as they can in each bunker. So And here we got the crew waiting at a Sunkist facility as they're waiting, and you can see some of these guys get pretty beefy as they move these blocks of ice around. So mechanical icing. Here we've got this fellow is pushing ice up onto the chain, which is going to take it up this ramp to the dock that's level with the cars. And we've got a looks like a refrigerator car here, so he may be pulling blocks of ice out of this refrigerator car that's next to him. This is a mechanical icing machine. You can see we've got a driver essentially up here and someone else. We've got a couple guys watching. We got arms that come up and down that blocks of ice come up here. It goes through a crusher and comes down these chutes and into the bunkers. Here's an example of that crushed ice going down that chute. Here you can see another, this is an Argentine icing machine and probably in Kansas City at Argentine Yard in Santa Fe. You see the blocks of ice coming along, goes into the machine's on its own set of rails, arm comes down, crushed ice goes into the car. Here's a mechanical ice loader drawing, gives you an idea of we got inclined pickup conveyor picking up blocks of ice. We get the crusher, we got salt bins, we get a slinger, a salt feeder. Yeah, everything's all here controlled by somebody sitting up on top. Here's another mechanical reefer. This is again Santa Fe. There's a good shot of the arm coming down and the cable mechanism using to raise and lower it. It's even got chains on the end so you don't have any ice going over the end of the car. So, by the late 50s and into this early 60s, these were very common. By the mid to late 60s, iced reefers were pretty much gone. They'd gone to mechanical refrigeration units. So these mechanical devices were not in use for a long time, but this gives you a pretty good idea of what they look like if you want to build a model of something like that. That's Fresno again. Look at all the bags of ice, or I mean of salt there lined up. So. Several different types of designs. You can see roughly the chunked ice here, a little bit bigger than your fist. Oxnard, early icing platform. Here's one in Pittsburgh in the PNLE, very small. This is more like what we would build for a model. Just a single dock with a small ice house. Versus this large one, Pasco and P. Here's one in another Pennsy. This is on the central New Jersey and the Pennsylvania. This is Bluefield, Norfolk and Western. There's another, this is an IC ice house. Here we've got one with some steam running. This is up in Burlington, Vermont. A very simple building with just a small platform and a couple doors. This is one somewhere in Canada. Port Huron up in Canada.
Michigan.
Oh, Michigan, is that so?
Yeah, back up that picture. Yeah.
Sure, Michigan. Okay. Grand Truck Western. I'm notice all the carts there on the platform. So yeah. 1920. Okay, you correct me if I'm wrong. Couple more shots to Florida. Here's a very large facility in Laramie. This is the ice plant in Laramie, Wyoming, 1921. And you can see that they've got it looks like they're set up almost for mechanical reefer then. Here is a simple sketch for an ice dock if you're wanting to build a model. That's not real complicated. There's also a couple of good kits out there. Tichy is it Tichy that's got the PFE ice deck, and then Walters has got one, so you can build models. Here is an interesting chart showing the required ventilation to standard ventilation in Laramie, then standard refrigeration as they were moving a train departing from Rawlins going to Laramie. And so on the different codes, the color codes saying, okay, what do we need in different stretches of this route or different cars? Okay, we got the engine here, caboose here. So each of these cars had different specifications for what they needed. They might just have hatches open, no ice, hatches remain closed with no ice, enough ice in the car, we don't need to add more. Here we need to add more ice and then amounts, re-ice at all regular station, here it says with 12% salt, so that tells you how much salt to add. Non-perishable shipments, no icing, no ventilation, no diesel, so basically standard box cars or maybe cars hauling canned goods or something, so. And here is an interesting chart. This is gives you the temperatures needed for each commodity. This is just fruits and vegetables. And you can see we're ranging from 32 degrees for apricots up to 70 for the early crop of potatoes. So temperature ranges, 32 up into the 50s and 60s are not uncommon depending on what you're shipping. So, if you really want to get intense on your weigh bills, you can specify we're shipping cabbage. We're going to have to ice it at 32 degrees. So we're going to need some salt in there. So keep your operators busy. And of course, there was the occasional passenger car and needed ice. And they apparently did not have a conveyor here. So that guy's getting some exercise, tossing a block up to his buddy. So those of you who run passenger trains, you want to be sure to remember to ice the diners. And if here's a simple operation where we just have a simple crane coming right out of the ice house, right onto the bunker. You don't need an elaborate deck for all this, just a building with some clapboard siding and a small crane and a platform. So, and then of course, if you really don't want to build a large elaborate one, this is the Monon, Indiana ice house. I have a feeling this was probably for servicing cabooses. They didn't require a lot of ice for cabooses, and they could pull up here, get some ice for the ice box in the caboose. And of course, icing cabooses was a part of the operations as well. And that's all I've got. I hope you guys learned a little bit. And
Doug,
thanks.
Doug, this is Rich.
Yes.
I'm working on a new clinic. It's not going to be a long one, but it talks about operations involving icing. That okay, we're going to ice refrigerator cars, but how many other things needed ice that you could move it in ice service cars, and from working maintenance away crews, the passenger cars, into train stations, into the ice operations in a community where it's then dispersed out to houses. And there's an awful lot of things that you can do with a load of icing service cars to deliver ice all over your layout as another operating situation on your layout. So
yes, I've got one town on my layout where the ice plant was not near it was on a spur off of the yard, and the icing platform was down in the middle of the yard, and it had a couple of refrigerator car bodies up on stilts. That was their supply of ice for that deck. So you had to move ice from the ice house, the plant that made ice, to those refrigerator cars. And there was a meatpacking plant in town, so they were icing, reefers every day throughout the day. The other thing you mentioned, passenger service, in the 20s and 30s, before mechanical air conditioning was being used, they were cooling cars with ice. The air conditioning was literally ice melting in bunkers underneath the cars, similar to a refrigerator car. And so those passenger cars would need to be iced every day or so often, not just the crew in the caboose, but your high-paying customers and those luxury seats you're selling tickets for needed ice. Plus the diner and the dining car and any lounge cafe cars would also need ice service. So they would any lengthy stop at a station would also they're replenishing the cars with ice, because that was not something you could keep for 3 or 4 days. That had to be replenished almost every day. So
then the maintenance away people needed ice where they were working, and at their shops. And so again, another movement, but I have some ice service cars that are in my collection that
Yep.
just say on the side of them, ice service car versus.
They'll say
refrigerator
ice
car.
service, yeah, ice service only, and they're typically owned by the railroad. And they would be used for
Yep.
moving ice for, yeah.
And you could use if you buy some of the older wooden reefer cars, you could turn those into ice service cars and stuff like that. So another thing you mentioned about the problem of it's carbon monoxide that was coming from those heaters.
Yeah.
And there's a whole placard series that I have of warning carbon monoxide refrigerator cars. I've got a whole collection of those that out there, which is another thing you could add realism to your refrigerator cars if you're using heaters. And when I was in Plant City, Florida in October, I talked to a guy who does 3D modeling. He has a friend down there who's doing 3D printing. He was from Illinois, and he's looking. I gave him the information about 3D printing the heaters for the use on your docks and stuff like that. So there's a company that makes them already because Joe Berger in Indiana has them on his icing docks and stuff like that. But there was another guy looking at making those and stuff. So
Doug, another commodity for icing is raw silk being shipped from the Orient.
Yes, the express reefers that were used to ship silk, yes. So, yep, you'd have to talk to the Great Northern guys about that one.
Milwaukee Road.
Yep.
Yep, got a mic.
Hey Doug, I got a question on that salting.
Yes,
Do you know if they published like a given formula for a certain temperature based on the amount of ice that they stuffed in there? I mean, the percentage that we saw was like 12%. And they would adjust that for different melting rates for different temperatures for the area, right?
yes, and I know that meat reefers were heavy users of salt. You might have up to 25% salt to ice in a meat reefer. Or if
Okay.
you're moving frozen product, because some of the, you started seeing items being moved in refrigerator cars, heavy insulated cars with frozen product, and they used a lot of salt to keep that temperature below 30 in those frozen product cars. Meat was typically shipped at about 34 degrees. So they use quite a bit of salt. If you wanted to maintain that mid to lower 30s temperatures, you had to use salt. And also the cooling fans with the produce, because the center of the cars would not get the same temperature as the end of the cars that were close to the ice bunkers. That was one reason the meat reefers were maintained 36-foot length throughout their careers, because they just couldn't get the center of the car cold enough to maintain the quality of the meat they were moving. And that's also why you saw a lot of top icing for the produce and fruit, was that maintained a more even temperature. It's also the reason the Canadian railroads use those top bunker refrigerator cars with the 8 hatches on the roof instead of the end bunkers, because they got a more even cooling as the cold air fell into the car from those upper bunkers. But that never caught on here in the United States, so we stuck with the end bunkers. So
you can buy models of the 8-hatch refrigerator cars online. I was able to get a few. I've got some on my layout in my collection. And then I found the one the other day in Port Huron next to the PH&D caboose that I sent Doug and Bob Chaparral pictures of it for real.
Doug,
yes,
this is Gary, question, once these refrigerated cars were unloaded, did it go through a process of house cleaning?
oh, definitely. Yep. If they would, I know for meat reefers, they would, well, the owner of the car, whoever the leasee was used, they would go through their inspection. Armour and Swift had large facilities, as did PFE, where the cars were routed to those facilities where they would be cleaned and inspected if any repairs needed to be made, if trucks needed or wheel sets needed to be changed out, that type of thing were all done at those facilities before the car was returned to its next shipping point, to be loaded. And they would be cleaned. You did not use steam to clean refrigerator cars. You just used hot water because the steam would heat the car. It would stay hot too long. And so they just used hot water to clean the cars out if they needed to be cleaned, meat reefers particularly, and then they could be pre-cooled and iced down again. You also had the USDA inspectors if they were hauling, consumable products, meat particularly, and those guys would inspect those cars as they were being loaded, and they might condemn a car or condemn a load because something as simple as a rusty meat hook would condemn a car load of meat. Same with a produce reefer. The condition of the car was maybe not as important for the produce because so much of it was packed up into boxes and crates and baskets, whereas meat, if it was hanging meat, could be damaged by something as simple as a staple in this car side where they tacked up cardboard to hide a hole in the car. So I have more information on meat reefers than I do produce reefers. So you'll have to go get Tony Thompson's book on the PFE and read it to answer some of those questions. And so.
But they had a lot of injuries.
Yeah,
Slip and fall off the roof.
yeah. I didn't see a guardrail
There
anywhere.
was no, but a lot of people. went-
No, this is all pre-OSHA. Yeah. Ice reefers were gone by the time OSHA showed up. So.
Yeah.
Anything else for Doug? Lots of smiles here. Thank
Yeah.
you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Lots of good ideas. Lots of
I-
good ideas.
I will see some of you next May because I am scheduled to give a clinic at the convention in South Bend the first weekend of May.
Okay.
Assume some of you will be attending that.
That'll be the Michiana.
Yes,
And actually, it's the Midwest region, but the Michiana chapter division is really the host with some help coming up from the Indianapolis area, the central Indiana division. So
mhm.
look forward to seeing you. I'm gonna do some clinics also, so.
Okay, very good. Enjoy yourselves.
All right, thank you.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yes, plan to. All right, goodbye.